Share content for your Meetup.
Okay.
There you go.
From iOS app, go from Android now.
Just want to stop the recording right now or no?
No.
Just keep recording. We're gonna start now.
Okay. Is this one set up?
I guess we're going to get started.
Might be able to be a little. I want a little closer.
Grab that last pizza, beer, soda, water. We'll get started.
Sam can take care of it. Keep it simple.
Joe, do you want to introduce Peter?
Peter's self-introduction.
I know.
We need to find another 100 people real quick though.
Yeah.
Plus everybody click the slants.
So thanks for coming, everyone. Welcome to Netflix. We're happy to host this evening with Grails and Peter Ledbrook. Thought we'd give you a little bit of an update in the beginning to let you know that we are really happy to host the Grails community. We do Grails and Groovy development here at Netflix, a lot of it actually. Our team does a lot of Grails, some Scala, some Python, some Java. So, and I know there are other teams around Netflix that do Clojure, all kinds of JVM languages. So if you're ever interested in talking to us about jobs, I'm happy to talk about that. We have some jobs on the Simian Army, which if you don't know what that is, that's Chaos Monkey and its friends, and we have lots of ideas where those came from, and I'm sure you do too. We have jobs around building continuous deployment tools, and Asgard is our tool for deployment on AWS resources, which Joe works on, which is a Grails app. Lots of fun stuff going on. So if you want to talk about jobs, come talk to me after, or come talk to Joe or Clay. Everybody's happy to talk about jobs. I guess Rob's here too. Rob. Somewhere, there's Rob. All right. Anyways, please talk to one of us if you want to talk about jobs. And but other than that, the man who needs no introduction, Peter Ledbrook, who is a Grails committer. Happy to have him here to talk about the road to Grails 3.0.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Right. First of all, am I coming? Yes, I'm coming through. Okay, yes. So thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. Thank you very much for Netflix for hosting. I do have to admit I have a Netflix subscription back in the UK. I kind of love it and hate it at the same time. I remember reading that Netflix have so much information about people's viewing habits that they discovered that people like to watch in, binge drinking. There's binge watching. And I have to admit I'm one of them. So Justified, Battlestar Galactica, I have wasted so many continuous hours watching those. They're fun programs, but...
How far back has the Gina 2 been placed by Netflix?
How far back is?
How far back has Gina 2, Grails in Action 2 been placed by Netflix?
I thought it was StarCraft.
Don't answer that.
Yeah, these are leading questions, and I am choosing, as a politician, to ignore them for the moment. Grails in Action 2nd edition is coming, and Groovy in Action 2nd edition just went content complete, so I gather. So we're under extra pressure. So I managed to do some work, so as soon as I get back and recover from jet lag, which takes about 2 weeks for me, get back straight onto it. Don't worry, Joe, it's coming. Right, so as you can probably tell, I'm borrowing this talk because it's an important topic. It's Graham's talk, and it's about the future of Grails and the recent Grails 2.3 release. So if you're using Grails, then I'm going to be talking about some nice features that you may or may not be aware of, but there's a lot of stuff coming in 2.3 if you haven't tried it out. So we're going to look at that first. Right, so 2.3 itself, ignore that slide, that's part of the Spring marketing. Grails is now formally part of this Spring I/O platform, and it's one of its runtime runtime execution environments, or something like that. Sorry, I wasn't briefed properly. I no longer work for them, so I apologize for that. But we're on more interesting things here. So we've got several things, like 5 things on that, another 4 on that. So we're going through about 9 new features. And Graham was saying that the team internally, like the Spring guys, were, hold on, you've got so much stuff going in. Shouldn't you really think about calling it Grails 3? It's something similar to what we did with Grails 2. I don't know if anyone remembers back then. We had Grails 1.4, M1, M2. Oh, Grails 2. But they decided not to do it this time. But a lot of big features. So I'm going to demo a few of them at the beginning and then go through sort of slides later on some of the later topics. And I don't know whether I'm going to have time, but I've got another talk which I'd quite like to do the first part of, if we've got time, on application architectures in Grails. Okay, so let's bring up the console, except it's died. Okay, my computer's not working. Right, so, sorry, Command Tab. Here we go, Grails version 2.3.0. It was released last week, just before Spring 1.2 GX. So, the first 2 things I want to talk about are kind of hidden features. They don't have very many visible signs that they have been implemented. The only thing is that they should make your life a lot easier. One of them is around dependency management. So how many Grails users do we currently have here? Okay, so about 2/3. So you guys, if you've been running into dependency problems, life should get significantly easier, which you'll be glad to hear about. And the other thing is to do with execution. So first, the dependency management looks the same as it did before. The only visible change is the dependency report. Now, this used to generate a HTML report based on Ivy. Kind of handy, very useful for working out where all those problematic dependencies were coming in from. So Grails 2.3 has a new look. It's in the console. In fact, it doesn't have the HTML report by default. It's just this one. But it's got the hierarchy, it's color coordinated, and you've got all the information there. As long as you've got a terminal that allows you to do find in it, you're good to go. And you can see where things are being pulled in from. One thing to bear in mind, it doesn't show conflicts. So if you want conflict information, like which versions were evicted, then you'll need to use Ivy instead. But under the hood, what's happened is this is now using Maven's Ether. I think it's Ether. Some people say Ether, Ether maybe. So Maven, I think for 3, kind of pulled itself out into different components. And one of them was the dependency management, the dependency resolver. And that's now being pulled into Grails. And this is the default. Now, when you upgrade, you will still be using Ivy. I'll show you in a little while what it takes to switch to Ether. Now, the advantages of Ether are it's faster to resolve, kind of handy, but possibly more importantly, it understands POMs. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but Ivy was a very solid dependency resolution engine, but it had its own dependency descriptor, ivy.xml. And all was good as long as you followed that and used Ivy dependency servers, dependency repositories. And then Maven came along and Maven effectively took over the world. So then you had Maven compatible repositories, so you had to work with those, and then you had the dependency descriptor, the POM. Unfortunately, Ivy never quite handled POMs properly, and that's why there have been various problems associated with it. One specific one that you will invariably have encountered are snapshots. So if you've been dealing with snapshots and not updating properly, That is now fixed just by switching to Ether, and that's why it's the standard. If you do go Ether, you not only lose the HTML reports, you lose the ability to pull from flat file for the file system. You can't use arbitrary repositories, structures. It's only Maven. Yeah, question?
How does that work with local plugins? So basically, if you have a multi-plugin project, you have to use local plugins. You generally use either flatter repositories, or at least there's a local Maven server you can set up, I guess. But does this improve things or make things a little more complicated for local plugins?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so it's about local plugins and whether this helps or hinders those things. When you say local, do you mean inline plugins?
Potentially inline, but the ones you develop that are private plugins, not published plugins.
Right. So things like, private. If you develop a plugin that's private to your project or private to the company, you've got several options. One is in-place plugins. Now, in-place plugins basically allow you to specify in your project the location of the directory where the plugin source is, and it will be compiled and be brought into your application. That has run into some issues because of the lack of POM. There's no POM, so it lacks information that dependency resolver needs. I think issues have been fixed, but I don't know about the long-term future of that. For other types, you have Maven install. So you install the release plugin, use the Maven install, that will copy it into your local Maven cache. And that will work with the Ether. Because Ether puts all of its dependencies in the standard Maven location, .m2/repository. So this also enables better integration with Maven shops that have all of their dependencies in M2/repository rather than the Grails specific cache. Okay? And of course, you can always publish to a Nexus or Artifactory instance for your company. You can still do that as long as you're using Maven compatible repositories. Okay, I was going to quickly show that if there's a missing dependency, it displays in red in this report, but I won't show that. So this leads me on to the next new feature, kind of hidden, forked execution, which kind of doesn't sound very exciting, but it is pretty important for you guys. So I'll bring up the console, interactive console, and what I'm going to do is run the application. I've got a very basic one here. It's library. I like book and author domain model. It's very simple. I can just knock it off very quickly, even while I'm speaking. So let's start the application. Oh, I can't spell run app. And that's all well and good. You all know about this stuff. How many people are using the interactive console here? Just to see a few hands, only a few people. So the interactive console is well worth getting used to because it does speed up, startup time for run app, test app, and various other commands. And it just makes you more productive. Okay, so run app works. We're going to bring this up. There we go. So the only real change is that I got an icon here saying full Tomcat server at the bottom. You don't get that normally. But otherwise, no other visible change. So if we have a look at there, we get our library application, go to author, it's just a basic scaffolded one, create a new author. I am a Neil Ferguson fanboy. He's always my first author that I put in there. The other one is Stephen King, of course. So, what happened there? Okay, I think that's, okay, we'll clear that. So, running application, let's just verify it. We've got our author, Neil Ferguson, so it is still working. What happens if it doesn't seem to be quite working? You need to make some changes. You need to update the tests. So you run test app. Previously, this used to cause all sorts of problems. The problem was that it was sharing the class path of the running application. And then if you run the tests and you change a few things, things get recompiled, and then the running application all gets very messy and things break. Then you just have to quit everything. So running my tests, got 2 failures here. I can still create a new author, Stephen King this time. Okay, so my running application is still working. I haven't polluted the database either. Remember, it's an in-memory database. That's not affected. And I can just quickly fix these tests. So I just need to provide some data here. I did not create this test. This was created by the generate command. So the key takeaway from this one is that Spock is built in, and it's the default. So whenever you create a new domain class, a controller, or whatever, it will create a Spock test. And you no longer have to fiddle around with the Spock dependency, which is kind of awkward because you had to do an exclusion and so on and so forth. So I'll show you that a little later.
Still need to use the test for mixin and the markup the domain.
Correct, yes. So as with JUnit, that needs the @test for and the @mock. So those are still required. So that's saved, and there's another one, book controller spec. And I need to add book. No, it's params author.id equals author.id. There. Okay. And even while that is running, I can still use the application. Okay, so this is the key difference that when you're in this mode, when you're in the interactive console, you can still get run the tests, keep the running application, everything works fine. And all the magic is happening, or all the configuration is in build-config.groovy. There we go. So you've got grails.project.fork. That is a whole bunch of settings. If you comment that out, if you remove it, you go back to the old behavior. It will just run in the same process. You also have grails.project.dependency.resolver. That is new, and that is set to Maven for a new project. If it's not there, you're still using Ivy. So if you want the HTML report, or you have some other, if you're using custom repositories with custom structures, just change that. Okay? So those are 2 core important changes that affect your day-to-day development, but they're not that visible, but definitely worth understanding and knowing about. Okay. We go, oh yeah, I've done that. And the other thing to notice is, even though it's running a forked VM, the tests are running fairly quickly now. When you first start the interactive console, it'll say, it'll say daemon started. So we've got a background daemon that's running the forked processes in the background. So they do run faster on subsequent issues. Okay? Right. Done with that. Let's have a quick look at the slides again. So, yeah, summarize. Ether, default. Based on it is the Maven dependency resolution engine. It fixes whole swathe of issues related to snapshots and the like. But you are limited to Maven compatible repositories, and we currently lost the HTML reports. Now, apparently there is no reason not that we can't have the HTML reports. It just hasn't been implemented, and the Ether doesn't provide it out of the box. So if you want HTML reports, go vote for it on Jira. Anyone want HTML reports? I kind of like HTML reports myself. Okay, we've only got 2, so maybe it won't happen. Come on, guys, go and vote. I want HTML reports again. So the other one was forked execution. So it's all about keeping the class paths independent and separate so they don't pollute each other. So you can have run app and test app all operating at the same time with no adverse effects. Okay, so REST support is a very big change. I'll show a few of the features. It's kind of come in different flavors. And the first one, I'm going to stop the application first, is an annotation on domain classes. Now, let's create a new one. I want a fresh one for this, org.example.person. There we go. And person.groovy. Here we go. So, just a couple of properties for this. So these all look the same as before, but the difference that I'm going to show is this annotation called resource. There we go. So it's in a new package, Grails.rest, and it looks like that. Very simple. Now, it doesn't need any parameters, but you will find that you will typically add URI. So what is going to happen here is that we are going to set up a URI called /people. In fact, it's going to be a full-blown RESTful URI. So what effect does this have? Well, if I run the application again, I can show you. But the key is that I've just added an annotation to an existing domain class, but it's going to have some web pages associated with it. They're going to be scaffolded, but I haven't had to create an independent controller. Okay, so it's up and running now. Let's have a look. So if you look at the main page, we'll see person controller. So I didn't create that. It's all created under the hood. And we see we're getting some XML back. Empty at the moment. That's all good, but how am I going to add data? And where's all my HTML gone? Well, we can specify deliberate specific formats using something like the format parameter, but that doesn't seem to be working. What's going on there? So let's try and refresh. If we have a look in here, we see 415 unsupported. So this is because @resource, by default, supplies will deal with JSON and XML, but not HTML. Okay? Very easy to fix. We just stop the application and go back to my editor. We can say, I want HTML, JSON, XML. In fact, anything that is in your MIME type map. So plain text, text/plain. Atom is in there as well, CSS, text/CSS MIME type. Anything that's in that map, you can put in that list, as long as you have something in place that knows how to create content of that type. So you can't just say, okay, render me CSS. I want to support CSS as a content type. Well, Grails doesn't have anything built in to serialize a domain class as CSS. In fact, it kind of seems like a weird idea. But hey, if you want to, you can create your own CSS renderer that will render domain classes as CSS using whatever logic you want. So we'll talk about that in the slides. So now, if I start the app again and we have a look, we'll see it's operational and we get the HTML pages. And you'll see that the URL is as I put in the @resource annotation. And in fact, because I specified HTML first, that becomes the default. So what use is this? @resource, I think, is good for quick and dirty apps where you've got a domain model, a database, and you want to expose that via a CRUD RESTful interface. So you want to be able to, you want to let people or applications hit the URLs using JSON to create new entities or to retrieve entities. So for that, it is so quick to get it up and running with @resource. But you have no control over the URIs, and you have no control over the controller implementation. So it's very convenient for quick and dirty stuff, but it's not really something that you would use for a full-blown proper application. So we don't have any people at the moment, so we go new person. Notice we now have /people/create up there. So I can say, let's bring me into the system. And now we have people/1. Okay, so they're RESTful URIs. It's the domain, the resource name, people/identity for that person. All fairly standard stuff. And if you want, you can use the format argument, or you can use .json, and we get the data back as JSON. Replace it with XML, we get it back as XML.
Is this using the new scaffolding plugin that knows the resources to do auto scaffolding?
Yes. So I'll quickly touch on that. But the question is this using the new scaffolding plugin? And the answer is yes. So the scaffolding has changed completely in terms of the controllers. And I'll show you an example controller so you can see how it's changed. But if you don't want to use @resource, but you want to be able to use these RESTful URIs without having to manually create the mappings, because at the moment you can do this, but you have to manually create the mappings. You then have to have long with format blocks in your controller actions and so on and so forth. So you can instead, let's change our author controller instead. So if we go to home, we can see that our author controller is very standard, /author/index. If I want to do new author, it's /author/create. There's no authors. If I want to view, have I lost my authors? Yeah, I've lost my authors. So Neil Ferguson, if I want to view him, I get a show in the URL. Now remember, REST should not have verbs in the URI. So how do we change our author? Thank you. We go to author controller up here. There we go. Okay. I am a master Vim user, really. I do know what I'm doing. So this is the generated scaffolding. Looks quite different to the old style. And in here we have a new method, respond. And it's respond that does a lot of the magic. It has a look at what the content type is of the request coming in, and it has a look at what does the user want back. What's in the accept header? Is there a suffix, .json, .xml? Is there a format URL parameter? Respond handles that and takes a object or a list of objects and automatically serializes it using the appropriate format or generates the HTML. So to get those RESTful URL mappings, we go to here, we say /authors, resources, and we say which domain class or resource that we want to map. Okay, now if I go to home, click on author, the URL is now /authors. And now if I want to click on Neil Ferguson, it's authors/1. No verb in sight. Okay? Just to prove that... Sorry? Right. Good question. So the question is, what happens if you hit edit? Now, yes. There's a verb in there. But it's after the ID, rather than before. But the thing is, with HTML, you need a page to post data. So HTML forms and stuff do not match RESTful UI, RESTful interfaces. It's as simple as that. So Rails does something similar. You get a create page and an edit. You get a create URL and an edit URL. But you can exclude those. In that mapping, you can say exclude, create, edit, so that they're completely unavailable. Okay? Right. So, going to use a new tool, REST Shell. It's a Spring project. It's based on, anyone who's ever dabbled with Spring Roo will recognize this thing. Or if you've used JBoss Seam, I think it was Seam that had something that looked very similar but wasn't Spring Roo based. This allows you to interact with a RESTful resource. So this is currently defaulting to localhost 8080. I strongly suspect that the yellow is a little bit hard to see. Don't worry, not a big deal. So the resource I'm interested in, first of all, we have the app URL, the application context. That's library. I can do a get on it, and I get back a bunch of HTML. Not what I was really hoping for. But remember, this is the index page. I'm interested in authors. So let's go up one level, go to base URI authors, and have another look. Okay, still HTML. What's going on? Well, remember, HTML is the default. You can change what formats are supported by the controller. So if we have a look, where is it? Back into author controller. You can add, I'm not going to do it, but I won't save this, but you can do response formats equals. So you can say this supports JSON, XML, but not HTML. Okay, so you do still have control. It's similar to the formats argument to the resource annotation. Okay, so how do we get our JSON if we want to use JSON? Well, normally if you've got a proper REST client, you use accept header. So that's what I'm going to do. Headers, set, name, accept, value, let's say application / JSON. Let's bring it back to the top. And now if I do a get, I'm getting JSON back. What happens if I try to put some data? What is this? This is authors. So I'll try and put my co-author in here, Glenn Smith. And you see 405, method not allowed. Kind of expected. You can't put to something that doesn't have an ID yet. This is what post is for. So if I simply change that to post, 201 created, and now if I do a get, I can see I've got Neil Ferguson and Glenn Smith. I can just get number 2 as well. Okay, so a lot of the mechanics of having a properly behaving REST interface is now handled by the combination of the URL mappings with resource and resources and the respond method. Okay, any questions about that stuff? Cool. Oh, yeah, Joe.
What if you don't have domain objects because you're not using a conventional database, but you just want to create a REST interface that's very traditional like this, based on controllers, but I guess I'm asking, what if you don't want all the magic to happen based on domain?
Right. So the question is, if you don't want everything to happen just based on the domain classes, if you want to have a RESTful user interface, which could be backed by remote services or anything, in fact, a NoSQL database or no database at all. All of this is geared around the controllers. So there is no, @resource is the only thing that's kind of tied to domain classes. Everything else, respond and the resource argument to the URL mappings is controllers. It's how, as long as respond knows how to deal with the objects that you pass it, everything's good. And they do not have to be domain classes. So yeah, good question. We're not tying you to having domain classes.
It could be maps, for example, or some other DTOs defined in subgroupings.
Yes, so they could be maps, they could be DTOs, anything really. So respond has quite a bit of magic underneath it, but that's implemented as Spring Beans, and the slides show some of that.
And I missed the point. How did you create the controller?
Right, so yes, because I didn't create the controller while I was doing this, I just used generate all. So the generate all command will create static scaffold, these files, the controllers and the views. If you just use static scaffold equals true in a controller, that's dynamic scaffolding, it will still use this same base code. You'll still get RESTful controllers. Okay. Right, so that was it pretty much. So there's resources, which I showed you. There's also a resource argument in the URL mappings. Let's try that again. URL mappings. So you could change this and remove the S. Not my most favored difference. It's very easy to forget the S or add the S and not notice because it changes the behavior. So resources, you use resources if you've got more than one. There's more than one author, there's more than one person, there's more than one book. So you want to use resources. But if it's just a single resource, I can't think of an example of the,
Configuration?
A configuration, yes. Actually, yeah, that's a good idea. So config. If you want that as the mapping, then you use resource. There can only be one configuration, and that changes the URL mappings. The actual mappings, the URLs and the actions that they map to, fully documented in the user guide. So check that out. Okay, so quickly go back to slides. What I didn't mention, didn't show, there's also built-in versioning. Now, I wrote the chapter on REST in Grails in Action and the second edition as well, so I know what a painful subject versioning is. So rather than fixing you to a particular type of versioning, such as putting a version number in the URI, Grails gives you several options, and it has built-in support for those, so you don't have to worry about implementing and mapping versioned API to the corresponding classes. It supports a version in the URI if you want to go down that route. It will also support MIME types. So in the accept header, you can create a custom MIME type with the version in it. Or you can use a accept version header, and that just has a version number in it. So I suspect I was unaware of accept version, but by the sounds of it, accept version is going to be the most, the easiest and more manageable solution to the versioning problem. Something I didn't show, you can get nested resources. So really that is best shown. Let's do this very quickly. So I don't think I need to stop that. Let's go to the editor. A nested resource is like this. Inside my authors, I can say I also want books, resources, book. Okay, and now, all being well, let's add a book for Niall Ferguson, Colossus. Okay, I can now do authors, 1, books, 1, like so. So you've got nested URIs, authors /ID /books/ID. All done with a couple of extra lines in the URL mappings.
What is that doing? Is that books 1 is still a unique object? So you don't need authors 1 to specify which book.
Right? So it has many.
So
It has many of the
It's just showing both domain objects?
no, it's only showing the one, but you can. It's the books associated with that given author, so it allows you to associate it in that way. So if you've got a child relationship and you want to represent that child relationship in the URL, you can do it like this. It would kind of be more useful if, say, the IDs of the books were not unique. They were only unique to an author. Yeah.
There's actually,
Sean.
even if they are unique, if you still want to, you can subclass RESTful controller or extend it and override some methods, query for resource and list all resources, and then you can adjust it so that will only, even if they're just standard ones where they have IDs that are global, you can still, it'll add to the query. You can add to the query and only find books that belong to that author. It's pretty easy to do.
Right, right. So actually, I think the default controller, so you can extend RESTful URL controller. So for all those people who are from Rails and have been missing extending a controller, there is now a RESTful base controller that you can extend. So you can extend that and get tie the sub resources to the parent resource. And in fact, if I did say authors /1/books, that will only show the books for that particular author. That's already built in. And as I just showed, there is no books URI. That books URI is only available as a sub-URI of /authors if you have a nested mapping. Okay? Is that clear? We can discuss later if you'd like. Right. There's a new URL mappings report. That's kind of handy if when you've got things like the resources. So if you've got your own manually created URL mappings, they're already in urlmappings.groovy, so you can see them and read them fairly easily. But resources creates a whole bunch. So if you run URL mappings report, you'll see the /books/1 edit, create, all of those things that were created for you. So it is possible with the @resource to make a resource read-only. So @resource has a read-only attribute. So that's available. That's the configurable HTTP methods. So that means post and put and delete won't work. Pretty much only get and head. And yeah, we've talked about the respond method, which handles HTML as well. If you want to use that, it will pick up the appropriate view based on convention. So it's pretty much behaving as it did before, but all the RESTful stuff is working just out of the box very nicely. Now here's the example of customizing the rendering. So remember I said if you really wanted to render a domain class as CSS, you can do that just simply by creating a renderer class and configuring it as a bean in the Spring application context. So here we have HAL JSON renderer. So HAL comes in two flavors, HAL JSON, HAL XML, and it's about HATOS, hate OAS, horrible acronym. I don't know why we still have it, but I think we're stuck with it from now. That is all about being able to discover resources. You know, the resource will come back and it will have links, you know, using rel, href. In HTML, it's like href. HAL kind of defines a language, a markup for that in JSON and XML for specifying relationships. And Grails comes with HAL JSON and HAL XML renderers if you want to support those MIME types. It also comes with atom support and vnd.error for, you know, getting back JSON in a standard format. You know, you've got a validation error. You submit a new person and you forgot to include the last name. You'll get a validation error back. where you can have that back in vnd.error format. Okay? And in fact, you can create your own renderers. The actual name of the bean doesn't matter. What really matters is the second argument, the class. So you can specify precise classes or interfaces that you want these renderers to apply to. So if you want your HAL JSON renderer to apply to every object in the whole system, you can specify object in there. Or you can do it for just a subset of your domain classes. So very powerful and flexible, and you've got a little bit of control over, say, which properties get serialized. Yeah. So I think most people will stick with the JSON renderer, XML renderer, the HAL ones, the built-in ones, but you have that flexibility if you need it. And as someone mentioned, is all this coming from the Scaffolding 2 plugin? Yes, there's a new plugin. It is a plugin. It's a default plugin. It's no longer in core. So if you look at buildconfig.groovy for a 2.3 project, you will see scaffolding plugin included. There is a version 1 if you want the old scaffolding stuff. I don't think many people will go for that. Scaffolding version 2 does everything the old one does, plus all this other stuff I'm talking about now. It also comes with Generate Async Controller. I'm probably just going to talk about the async stuff rather than demo it. And that allows you to get a controller using the whole Servlet 3 async stuff. And that's the next topic. Big changes around that as well. You get the RESTful controller that you can extend, and those are the 3 types of versioning that I mentioned. Okay, so big changes in the REST space, quick and dirty without resource. We've also got the URL mappings, and respond are the really big key changes that will impact proper Grails applications. Yeah?
Just a quick question on the versioning. How does it detect versioning changes through DB migrations? Or how would it detect that there's 2 versions?
Okay, so the question is, how does it detect new versions? It doesn't. All it's supporting is the mechanism for specifying a version. The client specifies a version of the API that you want. Yeah, so you still have to implement and decide. There is some support, which unfortunately I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think there's something similar to with format for doing the version stuff. But yeah, you still have to do most of the grunt work that side. Okay, we'll skip that demo. So async is Servlet 3 came with this whole thing. People were saying how cool async and stuff was, NIO. It was much more scalable. You break that connection between the thread and a request. So you no longer have a single thread per request. Question?
Just before we finish REST, do you have a preference about versioning? Which mechanism is the best for some reason? Right, so I was kind of undecided. When I thought it was so the question was, do I have a particular preference for the versioning type? I was kind of undecided when I thought there were just the 2, a custom MIME type or in the URI. And to be honest, neither was particularly satisfactory. I think accept version, though, is probably the best way to do it. It's very clear cut, so you don't have to create your own custom MIME types and things like that. You mean the header? So the accept version header, yeah. The accept header with custom MIME types is more work, and you have to deal with VND dot something or other type MIME types. It's kind of an impure REST interface if you have the version in the URI. But sometimes you have to be pragmatic. And are clients happy to send this non-standard header, accept version? Most clients would. So the question is, would clients be okay sending a custom header like accept version? The thing is, for most clients, if you are dealing with a RESTful API, as a RESTful API, they allow you to specify whatever headers you want anyway. I mean, you usually need to specify an accept header.
you have to specify the custom MIME type. So yeah. Okay, so async stuff. This is the kind of response to Node.js things, and people saying that the thread per request doesn't scale well, and it doesn't. Threads are an expensive resource, so you need to break that connection. So what Grails 2.3 does, now Grails 2.2 came with Servlet 3 async support. It was a start async method, and you just put your controller action code inside the closure. But beyond that, you are left up to your own devices. Grails now introduces a full-blown concurrency API based on promises, which then hooks into the Servlet 3 async. So you have a more seamless experience from not just the servlet end of it, but also back end if you want to do things asynchronously. Because if you're going to do async stuff, you want to do it all the way through. There's no point doing async servlet and then offloading to blocking queues and using effectively doing a thread per request in any way. Okay, so having this smooth transition through to the back end is important. Now, there are many different ways of doing async stuff. The Groovy now comes with the gpars library, and that has data flow, consecutive or concurrent sequential requests. CSR is the acronym. I can never remember what it actually stands for. Actor model, popularized by Erlang and Akka, the Akka library. Promises and effectively the same as Scala futures are just another technique, but one that is usually easier to understand and certainly easier to manage than, say, callbacks. Now, before you go off and suddenly throw promises everywhere, concurrent programming is not easy. These just are easier than trying to do threads with synchronized. But ultimately, you can still block things using promises. You can get the ordering wrong. You can still have concurrent bugs that are difficult to debug, no matter what API or technique you use for concurrent programming. So Grails 2.3 has the promises. Notice it's not gpars promises, it's grails.async package. And also note that it's the promises class and we're doing static imports. So it's no longer magic methods added dynamically to controllers and services and the like. They're just static methods that can be imported statically. So task allows you to do any arbitrary amount of work asynchronously. So what task method does is return this concept of a promise object. So at that point, you don't know, it may have started work, it may not. But you can either do, say, p1.get and say, I need this result now. And you will then wait for the result to actually be evaluated and returned. Or you can wait on a whole bunch of promises using wait all. I'm pretty sure there's a way of doing, it also has support for composite promises. So you can say, this part of the pipeline depends on these two asynchronous tasks, and I want my composite promise to be async as well. So you can pipeline them together. So a single promise can be a composite of other promises with its own task code. So it's fairly straightforward to use. And to understand, to grok. You just do a .get or a wait all and say, just continue once I have all of those results. Okay, so, oops. This, as you'll see, this hooks into the controller actions, which is important because you need some way of hooking into the asynchronous response. So when you do start async, you get an async context, and then you're detached as soon as you get the async context and the request thread goes and does something else. you do your work, and then you've got to reattach and so on. It's not terribly complex, but it's involved. With Grails, you can just return a promise from an action, and it just handles that automatically. So everything is asynchronous, but it kind of looks synchronous to you. You can also magically turn any object, particularly services, into asynchronous jobs. So do app-delegate async, and all the public methods suddenly become asynchronous. It allows you to manage a synchronous version and an asynchronous version. I'm kind of undecided whether this is a good idea or not. I don't really like mixing async and sync. I like having clear barriers between the two. But it is an option for you. We can then also get GORM support. Now, I was mentioning to somebody, I don't particularly like the idea of having async GORM with Hibernate, because effectively every async call needs its own Hibernate session, which is kind of expensive, and you're kind of syncing on the database anyway. The database is not concurrent. So you have this option, but does it make sense? Debatable. But when you consider the new plugin, GORM for REST, this makes a lot more sense. So GORM for REST simply provides the GORM API in front of RESTful backend web services. So you're talking about remote calls, you're talking about I/O, and those could be, you no longer have a single point of contention, the database. You can have several different services. They can handle concurrent requests fine. So with GORM for REST, person.async.get will just go off, send a request, wait for the JSON response back, deserialize, and so on and so forth. And then you can just send all these requests to multiple REST services and wait for all the responses to come back, and then do your work and return your response. So I think that's a really useful, a good, effective model for GORM async. Yeah, question?
The ways database systems are built, quite often having multiple requests in flight simultaneously will help us increase the overall throughput of the database. So I can see where you would want to have multiples.
Okay, so
Async, even though you have just a single backend database.
yeah. So if your database can handle lots of concurrent requests, then yeah, this does kind of work. I'm still unsure about the overhead of having the Hibernate session per async. So I think we will see how effective it is with a database. It may work fairly well with MongoDB as well. So yeah, we'll see. I'm unsure, but yeah, good point. And this is how it hooks in. You can either, so the tasks method is just as before. So you can effectively make the controller action async just by using the task method. Remember task and tasks return a promise. So if your action returns a promise, then it will automatically hook into the Servlet 3 async mechanism. Very simple, very straightforward. But you do want to make sure that each of your model values is a promise in and of itself. Okay, or at least is not blocking an expensive operation. You do not want to put any blocking expensive operations in that map as a value. Notice that in this particular case, you can put a closure in there and that will automatically be turned into a promise. Okay, so data binding, again, something that's undergone a complete overhaul and change. Out of the box, it's still behaving as it did before, but you now have a lot more control. So you've got things like app binding format. In fact, it's no longer based on Spring. So we used to use Spring for data binding and property editors and that kind of thing. It's now a sort of Grails-specific one based on more groovy things, and quite a few annotations. So one of the most common problems was binding incoming data, dates, string dates, to a property. But the incoming date format, there are so many date formats. Everybody wants to do their own different one. This allows you to specify for a given property exactly which format is supported and does the conversion for you. In fact, you can do it based on properties, messages.properties. So you can specify a key code. So then you can have localized version. So you can say, okay, if somebody's got the US English locale, use this one. Otherwise, for normal people, us British, sorry, it's DDMMYYY. So you can do it based on locale. And you've got more complex arrangements there. So bind using is if you want to exactly customize, tell Grails exactly what code to execute to do the binding, again, in an annotation. All the response stuff happens. So when I did the post, so I posted some JSON. So Grails had to take that JSON, deserialize it, and bind it to an author object. Okay, that binding happened automatically, but it was done through these classes: a binding source creator, which creates a binding source. So binding source can be a map, or it can be JSON, XML. We've got XML and JSON binding source creators built in, but you can create your own. So you've got, in the standard Spring way, you've got a lot of customization options available to you. Just create the corresponding Spring beans and just use the appropriate types. That works for domain classes as well as command objects and everything else. Very small change. Normally this would be a command object person, but there's now support for domain classes. And now if there's an ID, so if the request comes in with an ID and says person with ID 10, then Grails will actually fetch that domain instance from the database and pass it into this action. So P will be that particular person instance. So if you're going for the CRUD model and doing a lot of things with domain classes, this can be a little convenience. Okay. XSS prevention. How are we doing for time-wise?
Okay.
Okay. So this is something that's been bothering people for a long time, bothered me as well. By default, Grails GSPs kind of fairly insecure. The problem was that you were able to specify a default encoding of HTML. You say every groovy expression in your GSP should be escaped as HTML before being rendered to the response. And that was the safe option. But you could never really make it the default because plugins may use encode as HTML and then in their own views. So if you change your default to HTML and then a plugin has encode as HTML, what do you get? Double encoded output. Ugly, ugly problem. We now have double encoding safe GSP rendering. So now you really don't have to worry about that. You can call encode as HTML or encode as JavaScript as many times as you like on a string. It will only encode once. So that means that with Grails 2.3, the default has now changed to the safe option, which is mostly HTML for groovy expressions. Tags are allowed to change what the current codec is. So, for example, take the JavaScript tag. Well, the JavaScript tag expects to contain JavaScript, so why would you escape as HTML? So the JavaScript tag can say, everything inside me, all the content inside me, should be escaped using JavaScript codec, not the HTML one. And then when it leaves the tag, it just switches back to whatever the previous one is. So you get this, effectively you get a stack of current codecs. And as soon as you leave a view or a tag, that current one pops off and it reverts back to the next one in the stack. So it's a very logical model, and it's a very safe model, and you are protected from double encoding. If you want to output like left angle bracket as a left angle bracket, you can enclose. I'll quickly show this. If this is still running, I made some changes to the index page. So we can see top left here, hey everybody, I'm script escaped there. And if we have a look at the output, there was a script in here, and that has been escaped as well. That's inside a G JavaScript tag. Okay, so that's the escaping in operation. Here we go. So this is in index.gsp. Somewhere down here, we have our G JavaScript alert. Now, as I said, if I really, really want to make sure that doesn't get escaped, I just use a raw method like this. Okay, save that. Reload. Boom. There's my XSS attack. So I think this is possibly the most important change in here. It's been a long time coming. And many thanks to Larry Hatari who implemented that. And it was always the struggle of doing that while also keeping it performant. So life has become a lot simpler for you guys in terms of GSPs and making sure your pages are safe from XSS attacks. So for those fans of Hibernate who want the latest version, Hibernate 4 is now available as a separate plugin. It's not the default. So this newly created Grails 2.3 project is using Hibernate 3 still. Hibernate 3.6.10, I think. But you can uninstall it and use Hibernate 4. To be honest, I'm not sure what the benefits of Hibernate 4 are. I've not looked into it. So it's really a decision that's up to you guys whether you upgrade or not. But they basically broke a whole bunch of APIs such that we couldn't just upgrade. We actually had to release 2 separate plugins. Okay, so boom, 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 boom. There we go, compile that. You may have noticed in our RESTful controller, there was a @transactional annotation on the controller. And when Graham gave this talk, somebody did ask him, that's not really recommended, is it? Well, not really. You don't want to do your transactional stuff in the controllers themselves. You don't want to do your database work in the controllers. But the transactional is there partly to ensure that when people are doing their benchmarks, that it runs quickly. Because if you just have transactional, then it defaults to a write transaction, which is much slower than a read-only. So if you have a look at the controller, it says transactional, read-only, true for the whole thing. It's only for updates that it's a write transactional. But this is actually a whole new annotation. It's not the Spring one. It replaces the Spring one. And the reason for this is mostly because of proxies. The Spring annotation introduces a proxy. It proxies your service, which leads to interesting problems if you call into a non-transactional method, and that method calls a transactional method in the same service. You still don't get a transaction because you're bypassing the proxy. Internal method calls bypass the proxy.
You use like get context, get bean, and everything properly.
So if you get the bean through via the application context, @transactional works fine. The Spring one works fine because you get the proxy. But this doesn't have a proxy. it's just a basic service, and it does AST. It's basically an AST transformation and adds the transaction boundaries into the bytecode itself. You can also, we've kind of introduced a new way of doing dirty checking, because dirty checking with Hibernate is awkward, and this one doesn't even require Hibernate. So I think this works with any class annotated with dirty check. You can say track changes, and then you can revert, you can check whether something has changed or not, roll back, that kind of thing. And action error handlers are another. So these are sort of small changes now, convenience features. Too old is the action. If your application throws an application exception, you can offload to a specific action to deal with errors of those types. So this is more geared towards application exceptions, your own custom exceptions, rather than illegal state exception or illegal argument exception, which is more normally handled with a 500 error page. We introduced the controller namespaces as well, so you can put all admin-related controllers into an admin namespace, a URI. Okay, so that's available, and that's it for Grails 2.3. Going to talk very quickly about Grails 3, but there is apparently likely to be a Grails 2.4, and that is based on Spring 4, so we're expecting Spring 4 to come out by the end of this year or early next. Groovy 2.2, and better support for @compile static. So more and more people are using Groovy's compile static feature, and you cannot currently write controllers and other artifact types with compile static. So the idea is 2.4 will allow you to do that, or mostly allow you to do that. Questionable whether you'll be able to do GSPs with that compile static. We'll see. So Grails 3 is more of a sort of look into the future. These are the kinds of things that the team are looking at doing. The first one has been on the roadmap for about 5 years or something. So I remember Grails 1.1, we were considering even then whether to use Gradle. Huh?
Remember 1.2 is going to be Gradle.
And 1.2 may have been definitely Gradle. Back then, Gradle was very new. They weren't really gearing it towards embedded use. And considering how long it took them to get to Gradle 1, it was probably a good idea that we didn't switch to Gradle at that time. But it has been put off for a long time. The simple factor of the matter is the Grails team don't really want to maintain a build system. It's not a core concern, and it's not a core competence either. This is the Gradle guys' day job. So we don't get the benefits of all their advances because we have our own build system. By switching to Gradle, we get all of the benefits of what Gradle does, which includes multi-project builds. It potentially includes parallel running tests in future, and just having all of that power, a formal plugin API for the build, that proper clean separation from build stuff and runtime stuff, which hasn't been there. We now have fault execution, which helps, but there's still little corner cases which are an annoyance simply because we don't have that proper separation between build and runtime stuff. There is also this idea of moving Grails away from being specifically a servlet-based technology. So the idea would be that Grails provides a lot of features that are applicable outside the servlet space. One idea is to be able to run Netty-based stuff, but also you've got things like the data binding, Gorm itself. You know, people have been asking for standalone Gorm for a very long time. So why not make these things available to people in static main type applications or netty-based applications or swing-based applications. We've got Griffin for that, but any type of application. And these would be kind of application profiles. I want a servlet-based web app, or I want a netty-based web app, or I want a standalone back-end job runner. So, for example, you may want to put a Grails app in front of Spring Batch and just have a RESTful URI interface to it, or stuff like that. So that's the idea there. And the profiles would be effectively collections of plugins, a set of plugins that are appropriate for that particular type of application. So Grails applications then become just collections of Grails plugins. That does mean that the core of Grails needs to be pulled apart. So all of that stuff that's still in the core, things like site mesh, GSP rendering, there are various other plugins that are still core. They need to be separated out so that you can install and uninstall them. And this is great for performance freaks because like site mesh, for example, and GSP rendering itself still are the slow parts of response rendering. So if you're only going to build a RESTful URI with a JSON endpoint, why do you want GSP rendering? Why do you want site mesh slowing down your requests and buffering the HTTP response? You don't. So finally, with Grails 3, you'll be able to exclude all of that stuff that you don't need. And that will hopefully bring down the application footprint as well, because you no longer need all this stuff. And those are the core two features, breaking it apart and having application profiles and switching to Gradle. So the big question over the Gradle move is legacy builds. We still don't know what can be supported. What of custom build scripts or custom event handlers? So if you've got an underscore events.groovy file, will that work? Possibly. Mileage will vary. We won't really know until this gets implemented and people try it out. But when I was at... Huh?
I'd so happily replace my underbar events script with a Gradle build.
So, yes, I would certainly be wary at this point in time doing custom build stuff. Limit it, keep it focused, only do it for when you're getting a real benefit out of it. But, we asked at the last Groovy and Grails Exchange last December, so how many of you in the audience would like us to switch to Gradle even if it means breaking backwards compatibility? Every single hand in the audience went up. Well, maybe not every single hand, but it looked like it. Just almost every hand went up. Yeah, it said, switch to Gradle, please do it. So yeah, we're going to try to have that bridge, but we'll see how it goes.
Related question about builds.
Yeah.
Do you think the plugin architecture will remain largely the same, or is there any talk about sort of like repackaging that to OSGI or something?
So yeah. The question is, are there going to be any changes on the plugin side, how to develop plugins, how they get packaged, and so on and so forth? Because as you are quite correct, there were thoughts of going OSGI so that you could uninstall and install them at runtime in a running application. There has been no talk of OSGI since. So I'm not sure it's off the table, but I think that's less of an issue. I think it's much more important that a proper, formal plugin API gets put in place. So all of those integration points that some of us core developers know about, but almost nobody else does, having some proper interfaces, typed APIs, documented, because effectively Grails 3 is going to be a plugin platform. And therefore it's important that the plugin platform side of things is done properly.
Yeah,
so.
Bravo. I agree, because largely I teach my class something called Grails in the Large or Grails in the Enterprise. And part of it is for large teams, obviously you guys here at Netflix do this, but building your own plugins is kind of a core part of how people extend Grails, you know?
Yeah.
That's why I asked. So.
Yeah. So certainly, I mean, one of the big advantages of Grails is the plugin system. So hopefully the moves there will be towards a properly documented API and getting people involved. And also the tooling around doing plugins, because for a long time there hasn't really been support for properly testing plugins or best practice in testing plugins and so on. So that's the kind of thing they're thinking about. You say create an application using a particular profile. Yeah,
well,
Joe.
If you wanted to migrate almost all of your application or parts of your application into plugins, is there going to be IDE support and reloading support that's equivalent to monolith Rails support, where you don't feel like you don't want to work in a plugin because it's not quite as easy as working in your monolith?
Right, so yeah, the question is there going to be support for sort of automatic reloading and the general productivity if you're going for plugin-oriented architecture? And in-place plugins were that mechanism, and they did support automatic reloading. It did break at some point, and it's come, and then I think that's fixed now. But to be honest, don't know at this point in time. Hopefully, yes. It will partially depend on the Gradle work. But if you think about it, it is kind of quite awkward. I mean, as far as I'm aware, plugins will still be source. So there should be a way of doing it. And it may just be that it triggers a Gradle compile to build everything. And that's still all running in the same VM. So the spring loaded will still be able to work. So it's feasible, but I don't know for sure. But yes, for these types of things, for Grails 3, I do recommend that you get active on like the dev mailing list and ask these questions and say, hey, these things are important to me. Are you going to ensure that there's going to be support for this? Or what are you guys doing? What are your plans in this particular area? So yeah, I would definitely get involved. Okay, so the compatibility, actually the build system in itself, not just the compatibility, is going to be a big task. So there's no schedule. I think they're looking for at least a milestone release sometime next year. But they've not committed to anything beyond that. Okay. Any more questions? And I'm no longer part of Go Pivotal. I'm not a part of the Grails core team. Still a committer. Haven't done much. So yes, don't give me too much grief about this. Don't ask me to implement something. Not there. Okay. So no questions? I think we're still here for another half an hour afterwards, chatting and everything. So yeah, definitely come up and chat to me. Thanks for coming. All done. Cheers. And unfortunately, no time for application architectures, which is a shame. There is one slide, which is basically think about what you're doing. And that's the key message from that talk. Because I can actually, nothing's working on this at the moment.
Still have 4 minutes if you want to do the fast version.
Yeah, it depends whether I can get hold of the Grails architectures. I don't have permission to do it. No, I always present in a different account. Hold on, that's Road to Grails 3. Ah, here we go. There we go. This is how you build a Grails application. You create your domain model. That's your database. Then you add scaffolded controllers. Boom. Of course, then you progress. You say scaffolded controllers, great for doing some quick development and getting you going, but you want to build a proper user interface, and then you introduce controllers, and of course you do the proper thing, you put a service layer in there with its transactions and the like. And yes, thank you, that is the entire talk of application architectures in Grails. But yeah, it's not. So the whole talk is about getting away from that mentality. It's like everyone comes to Grails and that's pretty much the way they do application development. But it's not necessarily the best approach. And so the first half an hour, which I wanted to talk about if I had time, was domain-driven design. Actually sort out your problem domain first. Don't go domain class first, because it's easy to think domain classes, domain-driven design. Domain classes, domain-driven design. I'm doing it right. No, domain classes are persistence classes. So as soon as you start using things like has, many, belongs to, and all that stuff, you're tying yourself to a persistence layer. And then you're kind of, it's like coding with one arm tied behind your back, because you are now hindered by the impedance mismatch between object models and relational models. And Grails supports other types, and I go on about eventing-based models, messaging, or other types of model, using command objects as the primary domain model rather than persistence layers. So ultimately, that talk is about, think about what you need to do. Don't just automatically architect using controllers, services, domain classes, transactions, boom, because it's not always appropriate.
So there was a talk on Skills Matter by, it was Russ Miles, or one of you.
Yeah, Russ Miles.
Was it might have been Russ. It was talking about command objects representing application state.
That was David Dawson. But he's the same company.
Dave the Coder.
Dave the Coder. Yeah.
But I mean, kind of a similar thing. So be like, okay, so like, so stateful, obviously stateful applications on scale. So, here's a way to represent your web state using command object.
And also the idea was building plugins full stack. Each plugin has full interface. So actually your application is composed of multiple plugins.
Yeah, he did a talk on plugin architectures as well. This talk does borrow liberally from his talks, and he does some interesting stuff. But it's kind of, okay, you think about your domain model. The database persistence is an integration concern, as is the HTTP at the front end. And the question is, which side is your domain model closer to? If it's close to the database and CRUD works, then hey, go CRUD, use domain classes, services, and so on. But if your domain model is closer to what's happening at the HTTP side, what the user is interacting with, then command objects actually make a good use case for the domain model. Alternatively, you can just make it independent of both sides and just properly treat them as integration concerns. It is more expensive in terms of the work that you need to do, because you need to transform between the sort of HTTP side into your domain model, into the persistence layer. You have to keep converting things. You may have data transfer objects and that kind of thing. But once you have a proper domain model, other things tend to fall out. CQRS is an application architecture that is often talked about in relation to domain-driven design, but domain-driven design does not specify CQRS as the architecture to use. It's just one type. Okay, cool. So anyway, that was that stuff, and I'm happy to talk about that with drinks.
Yeah, I just want to say I had a sort of loaded question down this angle, and that's why I was asking about the plugins before, as well as sort of how you really model this stuff. Because all this new REST stuff is great, but my problem by its nature is you might want to have an admin interface that's for an HTML for people to go edit data, perhaps. Mm-hmm. If you have a mostly RESTful read-only service, I'm developing one right now, then you even have like possibly two different types of clients. You have the public clientele that shouldn't see all that's available in REST. You might all the different attributes or properties in your domain. So there's one type. You have another one that may be inward facing behind some sort of authentication. So, but you need you don't want to just basically play the game of hiding that detail unless someone finds out, because once someone has access to the internal interface, well, here's the rest of the information in your API. So you're kind of developing two RESTful interfaces, possibly the same domain model. So
yes.
I think it was a question of, is it best to develop your domain in a plugin, thus you can't use that resource in your domain because it's not directly exposed. Then you develop two separate applications or three separate applications. One is focused on HTML, one is exposing one set of APIs, one's exposing another set of APIs. It's public versus private.
Validation of this model too. I mean, validation is another concern.
Yeah.
Where do you put validation? If you make everything command objects, you put
Don't see the issue I have with always nice things in REST. You can put add resource in the domain model. Well, that may be not the point where you want to do it. You want to do your own controllers.
Yeah. I tell you what, should we continue conversation up there, and I'll go through. We'll just go up here. Okay, thanks.
Restrooms are right outside the door, and please take as much pizza as you can carry.